Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Harold Holt is most well known as the Prime Minister who drowned, but he was a remarkable figure in Australian politics for many decades before that. A protege of Robert Menzies, but a moderniser in his own right, he left an enduring legacy across the arts, Australia-US relations, and the Prime Minister who delivered the 1967 referendum. Joining me to discuss Harold Holt is Ross Walker, author of the newest and second biography on Holt. Harold Holt, always one step further. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Ross.
Thanks, Georgina.
It's lovely to have you here.
Lovely to be here.
I thoroughly enjoyed your biography. It's quite different from the sort of normal biography in that it really examines Harold Holt, the person and the relationships that framed him and his upbringing, but through his life. And I really enjoyed getting to know that side of Harold Holt, having, I guess, an appreciation of all the events and particularly the event of his demise. But
yes,
tell me about Harold Holt's childhood, because it's an interesting one, but it's also familiar. There's a few prime ministers and leaders who have a similar type of childhood.
McMahon had a similar childhood. His mother died when he was very young, and Holt's mother died when he was only 16, and his brother Cliff was 15. And it was, as you say, a disjointed childhood. Harold had attended 4 schools by the time he was 11 years old. The parents' marriage didn't last. Divorce was relatively rare in those days, but they were divorced by the time Harold was 10, and they were separated for a couple of years before that. It would appear, and I'm speculating, that it was the kind of marriage that wasn't going to work and was probably entered into because his mother was pregnant with him.
Yeah. Which was, something that occurred in that era.
Yes, it did.
And he moved between places, didn't he? I mean, you write, which I found amazing, about how he even went to school with Billy McMahon in Sydney, not knowing how their careers would intersect later
Abbott's home in Sydney, that's right. It was one of the aspects of Holt's life that made the book easier to structure and almost in some ways like the plot of a novel, was that people in Holt's childhood went out of his life and then came back in again, or in his early adulthood went out of his life and came back in again.
Yes, I think I counted
there were a
4
number.
or 5 who were in and out of his life.
There was Billy McMahon, there was Spot Turnbull.
Yes.
His school friend at Wesley. Turnbull was school captain and Holt was the deputy. And then there was a story behind that. Holt would have met Lyndon B. Johnson in 1942 when Johnson came to Australia with the American Navy and was hosted by Norman and Mabel Brooks. And then, of course, he came back in the 60s. They formed a very fast friendship. But Holt's childhood was fractured and lonely. He had some happy days at Nubba where his father, Tom Holt, had been born. His father appeared to have been an absentee father, less than conscientious in his attentions to Harold and his slightly younger brother, Cliff. And he was in the theatrical business, which meant he moved around a lot and spent time overseas. But one aspect of Holt's childhood that, frankly, I was very impressed with was that when Harold was 11, and living in Sydney, he met a boy from Wesley College in Melbourne who praised the school to the skies. And Harold said to his parents, I think you should take me and Cliffy out of Abbott's home, the school where they were, and send us to Wesley as boarders. I found it unusual and impressive that an 11-year-old would take an active hand in his own future like that.
And really, what a choice, because it really opened up a very different world. And, of course, the leadership of Wesley is such that he was really groomed for far greater things than he might otherwise have been.
Well, that's right.
famous headmaster, was it Dickie Adamson?
Dickie Adamson.
Yeah, who Robert Menzies knew because Robert Menzies had also attended Wesley College
Adamson was principal of that, well, headmaster as it was known at the time for, I think, 32 years.
Yeah.
Right until his death at age 72. But Adamson wanted the school small enough, I think about 600, so that he could know all of the boys individually, and he liked Harold and encouraged him. Harold had an interest in becoming a lawyer with a view to going into politics. Adamson himself had been a barrister in England, and was also the fact that moving to Melbourne meant that the locus of Holt's career later was in Melbourne rather than in Sydney, as it would have been if he'd stayed there.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, he does well at Wesley, doesn't he?
He does well at Wesley.
And he develops the nickname Puss, is that right?
Yes.
Puss Holt.
Puss. It's another unfortunate.
Well, nicknames are often unfortunate, but they are as they are.
He was Puss or Cat, probably because of the smile, the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland that stayed behind after the cat had left the room, you know?
Yeah.
Probably that. But it became a very apt nickname later in his life because, as you would see in the book, there's a pattern of him being in dangerous situations and almost losing his life a number of times. Almost, you probably could count the 9 lives of a cat.
Yes,
his luck ran out, of course.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there's a reckless disregard for his personal safety and sort of an irresponsibility that permeates his life, isn't it?
That's a pattern. It was almost seemed to be a default position, especially if he was unhappy or in some trouble, to place himself in harm's way, almost a default position.
Throw caution to the wind.
He was. Yeah. There definitely was a self-destructive side to him. His nieces, whom I've met recently, said he wasn't afraid of anything. He had no physical fear. And he had moral courage too, because he would make decisions that were unpopular or painful if he thought they were right, such as sending conscripts to Vietnam, which would have taken a lot out of a man of that temperament, I think.
Yes.
To have done that.
Yeah, yeah. And you describe, and we'll get to that later, but you describe the impact difficult decisions like that had on his sort of mental health, really. We would talk about his mental health in those days. You wouldn't have.
No, Menzies said in his last year, I think, he finished the year, that was 1967, in a very poor state of physical and nervous health.
Yes, indeed. So Harold Holt leaves Wesley and goes on to Melbourne University.
Yes.
And he studies law there. And it's interesting the relationships he's developing there, which of course are very important for the rest of his life. Can you tell me about them, Ross?
He was very good at networking. He was a good friend maker. When one of his biographers, well, he wrote a chapter about Holt. It was Don Whittington, the Canberra journalist, wrote in his book 12th Man of Holt's doggedness, which was not supported by outstanding ability. I disagreed. I knew what he meant, but I think Holt did have outstanding abilities in terms of his social skills and his ability to negotiate with people. Yes. I think they were remarkable skills. We see these from a very early age. It's probably fair to surmise that moving from one school to another as he did, he had to establish himself and establish his presence in new environments. And he had practice in developing those social skills. Part of it would have been genetic. His father apparently had charm, as did Harold. But some of the friends, well, there was Spot Turnbull from Wesley, who became a medical practitioner, a doctor in Launceston, and then later an independent senator, and became a very spiky critic of Holt, especially over Vietnam and the VIP aircraft affair. Holt was always a little unhappy that Turnbull had been school captain of Wesley when he was only the deputy and was still going on about it when he was Prime Minister. And Turnbull, I know, it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, because he was Prime Minister.
And Turnbull's reply was, but you're Prime Minister, Harold, and I'm not. And then also in those early days from Wesley and then following through to Queen's College, which was a familiar path.
Yes.
The Wesley boys, Methodist school, to go to Queen's College, which was a Methodist college, and it had many theological students too. So he was at Melbourne University studying law, Turnbull medicine, and also, not to forget, his great lifelong friend Johnny Buist, who described himself as the bastard from Bingle Bay.
Yeah.
And who later life became known as a conservationist working to conserve the Great Barrier Reef alongside other well-known people such as Judith Wright, the poet.
It's interesting. And of course, at university, Harold Holt meets Zara, who will become his wife in the 1940s.
He meets her while he's at university.
At university, yeah.
While he's at university.
But I found reading your book, it was fascinating that his core group of friends, so Zara, Johnny, and of course his lover, Marjorie Gillespie, and then his portrait artist, Clifton Pugh as well, they're all quite different in their political persuasions. I mean, would you say left-leaning, but at least they
were. Well, Pugh certainly was.
Yeah, and they took an interest in, I mean, he shared lots of interests with them, but you wouldn't, considering he was sort of the protege of Robert Menzies, it was hard to see how someone that was being groomed by Robert Menzies potentially to take over the leadership at one point was then part of this group of friends who were so very different.
And bohemian too.
And bohemian, yes, that's the right word, yeah.
I found that admirable, that he put personal loyalties above political views.
Yes.
And as I wrote in the book, he realised that if you dismissed people because you disagreed with their politics, you would lose the company of many estimable people. And I think he could see that.
Well, that's a wonderful sentiment.
He had quite radical friend in Brian Fitzpatrick, the civil liberties campaigner, who was too far left for the Labor Party. But Holt once insisted on speaking in tribute to him at a dinner.
Now, speaking of the Labor Party, Harold Holt was very attracted to the Labor point of view at university until he met Robert Menzies through his cousin, I think it was.
It was through Menzies' cousin. They met at Healesville at a UAP, United Australia Party meeting. And yes, he fell under his spell. I think it wasn't just meeting Menzies that made him choose that side of politics. He had been described as parlour pink socialist, but when he was at university, he made a study of socialism and rejected it. Probably because, as he said to Zara, when Zara said she thought the government should do this and that and the other thing to make people's lives easier, lot of social services and so on. He'd said, well, I think people would quickly become shiftless if you did that. So there was partly that. Some people said it was because the social life was better in that, on that side of the spectrum, and that's possible. He felt that the Labor Party regimented its members too much, and he disliked that.
He wanted a bit more freedom.
He wanted more freedom. And as Prime Minister, he certainly gave his colleagues.
Ross, tell me how Harold Holt gets into politics then.
He meets Menzies, who would have helped him along. He meets Mabel Brooks, who's I think describes herself as a progressive conservative or some such. He goes to meetings. His personal charm and personality are noted. And he jumps through the usual hoops. He's given 2 seats that are impossible to win.
Yes, yeah.
In the days when there still were seats like that. And one of them was in the Victorian Parliament, like Clifton Hill, I think. And then one for a federal seat. And then he's having jumped through the hoops, he's pre-selected for seat of Fawkner. And then he's only 27 years old. So he's ambitious.
And he's incredibly young.
He's young.
Yeah.
The youngest, you could think of Andrew Peacock might be a parallel.
Yes.
He too was 27.
Yes. Yeah.
When he was pre-selected for Kooyong. Yes, he is young.
And how does he find politics at 27? I mean, he's an ambitious man. I mean,
Yes.
charming, slightly reckless. or very reckless.
Yes, that became more marked as time went on.
Yes. But how does he find politics? I mean, particularly as the political fortunes of his party rise and, ebb and flow a bit.
He lives over a flat in South Yarra in the early days. He spends a lot of time as a resident in the Hotel Canberra. He became the longest permanent resident of the Hotel Canberra.
Which is now the Hyatt Hotel in Canberra.
That's right. He enjoys working in his electorate. He complains that the pay for an MP, backbench as he was in the first years, wasn't really sufficient, especially, he said, considering various costs, such as looking after people in the electorate who were hard up. So this was a sign he was generous. Zara said at one point, "Harry's the most unmean man I know."
And at this same time, he is involved with Zara. He's had other
Yes.
relationships, but since university, and they sort of went their separate ways, and she had a rather extraordinary. Would you say she went off in a huff a bit to?
I'd say she got married on the rebound, as they say.
Yeah, that's probably a good way of putting it.
Harold began seeing Lola Thring, who was also a friend of Zara's, apparently. And this was a story that you couldn't make up. And Zara found out about it and was furious and went off on an ocean liner to Europe. And I won't go further with the Lola story at this stage, but Harold's father ended up marrying her.
Yes.
So you couldn't make that up.
That must have made Harold and his father's relationship somewhat awkward.
He would cross the road if I saw him in the city. I understand they had very little contact, if any at all, in the later years. Zara married a British major who was with the Raj in India. In the early years of that marriage, she becomes pregnant and goes back to Australia to have her baby, Nicholas. And at this point, she gets back together with Harold.
Still married too.
Still married.
Yes.
While still married to James Fell. She is Zara Fell. And her husband comes to Australia from India to meet his new son. Zara is pregnant, and her husband could not possibly have been the father because he was on the other side of the world. And the marriage broke up.
Yes. Yeah.
She rather fudged the story in her memoir, in her book.
Right. Yes. And the two other children,
Andrew and Sam.
they were always sort of the stepchildren of
They were
Harold
known
Holt.
as the stepchildren.
Even though the supposition is they were probably his biological children.
Oh, I think it's accepted. It's widely accepted now that they were.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Not just the physical appearance and mannerisms and so forth. But I think it was a well-known secret with family and friends. But even in the 60s, which was supposed to be, the swinging and progressive 60s, it wasn't considered nice that Zara had conceived two children out of wedlock, as it was, or in an act of adultery.
So Harold Holt is doing pretty well politically, and the relationship with Zara has come back. But it takes a while for them to get married, doesn't it? Because he wants to.
It's a long hiatus.
Yeah. How does that end up developing?
They didn't want him to be seen to be a factor in her divorce, in the breakup of the marriage.
Yes.
So they waited until a decent interval had elapsed. 7 years. The twins are 7 years old when they have the family conversation and announced that they will get married.
And meanwhile, his political career has developed, hasn't it?
Meantime, he's come on with his first major bill, which was introducing the Child Endowment Act, where he was known as the godfather of 1 million children. A godfather of 1 million children and a bachelor at the same time, they said.
Yeah.
And he also has the Ministry of Labor and National Service. And it's as Minister for Labor that he was a particularly outstanding success, I feel, and probably the best Minister for Labor and Industrial Relations that we've had. And this was where his interpersonal skills, a feeling of empathy in that he was able to understand the point of view of other people. This was invaluable in that ministry. He was able to work very well with far-left communist trade union leaders.
Yeah.
And the number of strikes during his tenure dropped dramatically. Almost every day in the paper, and looking at his scrapbooks, his personal scrapbooks in Canberra, almost every day there seemed to have been a disagreement between the government and the wharfies.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was an incredible negotiator.
He was a very good negotiator.
Very good when you're the Minister for Workplace Relations or Labour.
He seemed to have a calming influence on people.
After the 1949 election, and he becomes the first member for Higgins then, doesn't he?
The new seat of Higgins.
Yes, the new seat of Higgins. One of very few members for Higgins. They were, almost all were pretty long-lasting up until more recently. But he becomes treasurer, doesn't he, which is a strange portfolio for someone who hasn't got a strong reputation of taking a great interest in economic policy and affairs.
It wasn't the most suitable portfolio, but it was the portfolio that seemed to be de rigueur for aspirants to the Prime Ministership.
Yes, yeah.
And interestingly, Billy McMahon becomes treasurer after him, and he has the same career path in mind. Though his record as treasurer is patchy, especially when the government introduces the credit squeeze, credit squeeze of 1960 and 61, and at the 1961 federal election, the Menzies government lost seats galore, especially in Queensland, and was almost defeated.
That's right. Arthur Calwell almost won.
He almost won.
Yeah.
And Holt's reputation was tarnished at the time, and there were even moves afoot to displace him in Higgins. But with time, this blew over.
Yes, and by 1963, the Menzies government does incredibly well, recovers all the ground they lost.
Recovered all the ground they lost and gained 10 seats, which was a remarkable result for an incumbent government on an election that had a lot to do with voter backlash over Labor's policy on state aid and the notion that the 36 faceless men were running the Labor Party.
Yeah.
And the Canberra photographer, whom Alan Reid, the journalist, saw Calwell and Whitlam waiting outside the hotel where the faceless men were working out what the policy was to try to find out what policy had been decided on their behalf. And it was a very unflattering photo. And the 36 faceless men, that was a mantra that the Menzies and Holt governments used
in fact,
constantly after that.
It's been used for decades.
The faceless men.
It was used regarding Julia Gillard's leadership as well.
It was
the faceless men who were running her government. So
it's a worthwhile and successful political tactic.
Yeah.
You hit on a slogan that damns the opposition and you keep repeating it. Such as 1993 election, Paul Keating, GST. Just kept hearing that.
Of course. Now, we get towards the retirement of Robert Menzies in 1966, January 1966. What was it about Harold Holt that meant that he was the heir apparent? Do you think Menzies had selected him particularly, or because there was a paucity of talent? I don't think there was, by the way.
Well, I think it was probably more the former, that Menzies had selected him. He was the anointed one.
Yeah.
And no one was going to oppose Menzies on that. Menzies, of course, his leadership style had not encouraged future leaders to come into the open.
No, he tended to dispatch with his internal political opponents pretty well. He'd send them off to be ambassadors somewhere, or
he would
make them ministers of portfolios that, he gave his ministers quite a bit of latitude, actually. And you think of Percy Spender and Casey and Hasluck, but he didn't let them get too close to the top.
Oh, no. No.
But with Holt, he was comfortable.
He was comfortable with Holt because he knew after Holt had voted against him in the leadership when Menzies was displaced in 1941. And I think Holt, that would have jarred with him because he believed so strongly in personal loyalty, so he would have been conflicted, but he felt it was better for the party. But he probably resolved that he would never do that again.
Yes.
And he probably never would have challenged Menzies even if Menzies had gone on till he was 80.
Holt's qualities, which you draw out in this book, were quite different from Menzies.
Yes.
I think you describe Menzies as being authoritative,
Yes.
very, very strong leader.
An authoritative personality, very much.
Quite unforgiving. And, of course, he's pictured in a very dignified way, always in the double-breasted suits, looking terribly formal. Holt was completely different. He was informal, collaborative, accommodating, and the iconic photograph of him is in a wetsuit.
Amazingly different, yes, with the daughters-in-law in the wetsuit at the beach or having a cup of tea in the deck chair at Portsea.
Yeah. So you really couldn't have got two more different leaders in Holt and Menzies, and yet
that's right.
Menzies selected this
he liked him.
Charming,
casual,
collaborative figure
all of
Holt
that. He liked
be his
him.
successor.
He liked him and he admired him, but he was disappointed with Holt's performance in his second year. He said he was besetting sin was he had to be loved by everyone. His last year, just dreadful.
Well, it did end pretty dreadfully.
It ended dreadfully. It was really the last 6 months, I think.
But then Menzies was disappointed in all his successes, not just Holt.
Well, he was.
So
he
wasn't perhaps personal.
He wrote to his daughter to Heather that he thought Gorton would be defeated by Whitlam in the 1969 election, and he had a very low opinion of him. And well, McMahon, of course, that dreadful little squirt, should have done something about him.
Yes.
And he'd said apparently he told Bob Santamaria that in the last couple of elections he voted DLP.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. It's interesting. You quote the legendary Canberra Mandarin Nugget Coombs describing Holt that he was too nice a person to exercise power successfully.
Yes.
He wanted to be the beloved captain of a team but struggled to keep the team together.
That's right. I found it was an endearing characteristic of Holt, but it was one that worked against him as Prime Minister. He wasn't tough enough.
As he was nearing the time he was going to take over the leadership in 1966, was there resentment, do you think, among his colleagues, people like McMahon, for example? Were they getting a sense that Holt was the one? And
I don't know if resentful is the word for McMahon, but somebody said, might have been George Negus, from the day he was born, Billy McMahon wanted to be Prime Minister. And he was certainly planning and plotting all the time. Of course, he was a horrendous leaker. Most of the leaks came from, or many of the leaks came from Billy. But I think Holt was generally well liked. It was only when he became Prime Minister there were signs that he was capable of doing things that were reckless or really quite stupid, such as a time in April of 1966 where he read out a letter to the paper from someone who was praising what the government was doing, so on, and he's asked, who signed it? And he admits it's not signed. And I can remember Don Chipp saying, it was dead pandemonium in the Labor ranks. Our side was aghast, and it was a stupid thing to do. But the main thing that worried us was that we realised we had a leader who was capable of doing something quite stupid.
Yes.
So I think, yes.
And after so many years of having a leader who wouldn't have made such an error in
absolutely
Menzies,
not.
It just would have never, ever happened. To have had that so early on, just 4 months after taking over the leadership, would have been very disconcerting for the Liberals in Parliament.
It was.
But he becomes Prime Minister, as we say, in January 1966, and is only Prime Minister until his very untimely death in December 1967. So we're talking 22 months.
Yes.
But, I mean, he's known, of course, for his death because it was so dramatic. And, of course, the mystery.
Understandable, I suppose, but a pity.
Because he does do some very significant things in those 22 months. And I'm always surprised how people don't realise they attribute some of his successes to other leaders, like what he did with White Australia, what he did with 1967 referendum, Australia Council for the Arts, the Australian Ballet, which happened when he was treasurer. But, I mean, these are significant achievements that shaped Australia into the nation we are today. And they are down to Harold Holt and his particular passions.
They are down to him, yes.
Can you unpack some of those for me,
I think
Ross?
he changed Australia's main focus away from Britain to Asia. And he was the first Prime Minister who directly said that Australia is a part of Asia.
Yeah.
And he did, I think, in his dealings with foreign leaders, particularly in Asia, he was a fine statesman for Australia and enhanced our reputation. The Vietnam commitment was unfortunate, but I don't think it negates his achievements in improving or enhancing Australia's role in the world, bringing Australia into the modern age after the long years of Menzies.
It's interesting that Gough Whitlam, I think, gets more credit for opening up Australia's eyes to the potential of Asia when Harold Holt, as you said, did so much. And actually Robert Menzies, of course, through the signing of the Commerce Agreement with Japan in 1957.
That's right.
Really started it, but that's often forgotten as well. Because Holt was Prime Minister for such a short period of time that he doesn't get the credit he deserves, or is it because of the shadow of Vietnam that's cast over him?
I think the shadow of Vietnam certainly didn't help, especially with hindsight. At the time, it's important to remember that most of the public was with him.
Yes.
And it was thought, even by members of the Labor Party, that we should be holding troops in Vietnam. The British government supported the American presence in Vietnam too, and that was Harold Wilson's Labor government. They expressed more reservations than Holt. Holt, of course, apart from his dramatic nature of his death, he's also remembered for saying, "We will be all the way with LBJ," which
to US President Lyndon Johnson.
That's right, which not even his own words. That was Johnson's campaign slogan from the presidential election 2 years before. And well, it was an indiscreet thing to say. It would have been better unsaid.
Yes.
I think it's unfortunate that those words are quoted against him as if they were the only words he ever spoke and the only policy he ever had.
Yes.
I think it's reductive.
Tell me about his relationship with LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. And
it was a personal friendship. They were very comfortable in each other's presence. They thought about things in the same way. They both had remarkable social skills. Johnson was, of course, a much more commanding personality, a much more in your face, twisting and tugging and, anything to get the votes that he needed from Congress and so forth. I remember when Gorton went to Washington to see Johnson in May of 1968, shortly after Holt's death, and Gorton had Tony Eggleton with him, and Johnson apparently said to Eggleton, "It's just not the same, Tony. I'm sorry, but it's just not."
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They obviously, as you said, had a wonderful friendship that was of decades standing, having met during World War II in 1940.
Yes, there's also this about it. Johnson being a very strong personality, there's a pattern of Holt being drawn to men who had very strong personalities.
Yes.
Dickie Adamson, the headmaster, Robert Menzies, Lyndon B. Johnson. The first two, certainly Adamson, and to some extent Menzies, could be seen as father figures. But Johnson, a much more powerful personality. His psychological acuteness was extraordinary, and he would have understood Holt.
And
would have also used him.
Exactly. Do you think because of that relationship and Holt's evident admiration and sort of somewhat deferential approach to Johnson, do you think that Holt was manipulated by Johnson to contribute more to the Vietnam effort?
I think he was certainly pressured. He was being pressured almost to the end of his life, but he got to the point where he said, "This is as far as we can go."
Yeah.
So he didn't really go all the way with LBJ. No.
But it was good rhetoric.
It was good rhetoric, and there was the episode in late July of 1967 when Johnson sends Clark Clifford, the wealthy Wall Street lawyer, a Washington lawyer, with Maxwell Taylor, the general, to meet with Holt and the cabinet and to ask for more troops. And Holt becomes very evasive at this point and says something like, I write in my book, Clark Clifford returned home somewhat defeated. He was especially disappointed by Australia's attitude. Australia, which had given so much during World War II, dismayed us the most. Johnson, who remembered the country with special affection from his brief service there in World War II, had counted on more from down under and his good friend Harold Holt. For his part, Holt used many words to say very little about the meeting, and he said, the talks ranged extensively over all aspects of the Vietnam situation, which the representatives of both groups raised. The exchange of information and views will be helpful to further consideration by the governments of both countries. In other words, he said nothing.
Yes, yeah. Ross, those final 6 months of Harold Holt's life, from mid-67 to the end, Vietnam was weighing heavily on his mind as casualties started to...
And as the public mood was beginning to turn.
And he had some unfortunate encounters where he was delivering speeches around Australia, but in Melbourne.
Melbourne University.
Where...
In the public lecture theatre just over the way there.
Yeah.
And he was pelted with paper planes and constant heckling.
Yeah. How did those last 6 months unfold? Because he is under incredible strain.
He's under incredible strain. He has a very heavy personal blow in March of 1967 when his brother Cliff dies from pancreatic cancer, aged only 57. And this is a huge blow because from childhood on, Harold and Cliffy, as he was known, really only had each other.
Yeah.
They had a very close relationship. There appears to have been little or none of the usual sibling rivalry. Cliff was always delighted at Harold's achievements, very proud when he became Prime Minister. And his niece related the story of how on the night of the 1966 election, Cliff was on the phone to Harold and pumping the air and saying, "You little beauty." He died, and then Harold immediately had to go off to Asia, an Asian trip, and it must have been a very lonely trip. Brings back to mind the circumstances of his mother's death when he was 16, and he's asked by school friends, "How's your mother?" "She's dead," is the answer. Well, he just tried to take things as a matter of course.
Yes.
But that was certainly a blow which would have weakened him and which he said himself apparently it was affecting his work. And then the certain backbenchers such as John Jess and Edward St John, Harry Turner was another one, were trying to open up again the investigation into the Melbourne Voyager collision 3 years before, feeling that there'd been a cover-up.
And this was the biggest peacetime naval disaster in Australia's history.
Yes, where the flagship of the Australian Navy, the HMAS Melbourne, sliced through the destroyer Voyager, had this frightful collision, a ship had been lost, and 82 sailors were dead. And there was reason to believe that the government and the Navy had worked and colluded to cover this up. And long story behind it, John Jess had personal reasons because he wanted to clear the name of Captain Robertson, who was married to a cousin of his. And he was a very forceful personality who wouldn't back down and said what he meant. Ted St John, a very eloquent lawyer. And they both move in Parliament to have the debate opened up.
Yes.
And it's then that Holt makes, well, you could probably almost literally fatal mistake of interrupting when St John is replying to the Attorney General's criticism that the Attorney General's, it was Nigel Bowen, claimed that evidence of Voyager's captain's drunken behaviour was irrelevant. And St John asks, irrelevant indeed. Are we playing a battle of semantics? Or have I lost the meaning of the word irrelevant? At this point, Holt, forgetting that this is a maiden speech and not to be interrupted, interrupts. What is the meaning of the word evidence?
Right.
And I can recall Gough Whitlam saying, it's not too much to say that episode destroyed Holt. I mean, Holt was a very pleasant man and so on, but the Voyager disaster, or at least his conduct in the parliamentary debate, destroyed his confidence. And he seemed to be losing confidence and morale.
Yes, yeah.
And his usual sparkling personality began to fade.
Throughout your book, you write with a sense that Holt's death was predetermined. He had lived a life that had this sort of pall over it that he was going to die in some untimely way.
Yes,
and
I think so.
You quote, which I found quite striking, from Octavio Paz's The Labyrinth of Solitude: "Death defines life. Our deaths illuminate our lives. Each of us dies the death he is looking for, the death he has made for himself."
Well, Holt certainly did.
Tell us about the death of Harold Holt.
He goes to Portsea on Friday the 15th of December, drives down in his own car, having tidied up some business in Canberra. His colleagues say, "It's a beautiful day today, Prime Minister. What's beautiful about it?" Or maybe he also said, well, maybe outside it is. He's had a series of electoral reverses during the year, including the Senate election only 3 weeks before, when the government vote went down 8%.
Wow.
And the loss of the Corio by-election in July was a shock. And he's probably taking all this personally, and he would have heard word that members were working behind the scenes to depose him. John Gorton said, who was certainly had his ambitions, but there's no evidence that he was one of those people. But he said Holt was being undermined all the time by McMahon, who was working around among members trying to get rid of him. He would have been hurt by that because he had his suspicions of Billy, but he thought of him as a friend.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, having known him his entire life.
No, that's right.
So he goes down to Portsea by himself in his own car.
Yes. Couldn't happen today.
No, you can't imagine.
Stopping on the way to do his shopping.
Yeah. He gets to Portsea. And,
yes. He meets Marjorie Gillespie at the fish shop in Sorrento, I think it is. Goes for a swim. We don't know where or with whom. Comes home about 5:30, and Tiny Lawless, the housekeeper, the long-term family retainer, is there to look after him in the household. The following day, it looks like a normal domestic scene, family and grandchildren there. He plays tennis in the afternoon, having been strongly encouraged by his doctor, Marcus Faunce, to cut down on swimming and playing tennis because he had a bad shoulder and a pinched vertebra, which was giving him enormous pain. He's taking morphine pills for this. Zara writes in her book that in the last months the last weeks, he was quite unable to sleep. So he's not well.
No.
Worn out, overstressed, overstrained, always prone to reckless behaviour, but even more so in that debilitated condition, I think. And perhaps enters that water thinking where do you go when you're depressed and unhappy? You go to your favourite place and you go to your favourite element.
Yeah, and he loved swimming. And
he loved the water.
Yeah.
He's not as good a swimmer as is made out to be. He's not a particularly good swimmer. He's an excellent snorkeler and skin diver.
Yeah. So he goes to Cheviot Beach with Marjorie Gillespie, his lover, and some friends.
With her daughter Vina and the then boyfriend Martin Simpson, and Alan Stewart, who was the boyfriend of Marjorie Gillespie's late daughter Sheridan, who had been killed in a car accident early that year. They go, first of all, to see Alec Rose the yachtsman, come through the Heads on the way to Melbourne, and then go through into the quarantine station, where there's an amusing episode where the young cadet on duty at the army barracks doesn't recognise him and calls out, "Holt, who goes there?" "Holt," he says. "Well, you can't come in. Don't you know who I am?" "No." well, I'm Prime Minister. So they go to the beach and it's a wild scene. It's a very hot day, a blustery day, and the tide is high and wild. The party have comment on the heavy driftwood that's being lashed against their legs. Martin Simpson and Vina Gillespie go off on a walk with their back to everything that's happening. Alan Stewart goes into the water just up to his knees and feels a terrific undertow and retreats. Holt, however, gets into his bathers and his only bathers and sand shoes. Marjorie Gillespie asks, "Surely you're not going in?" And he answers her by striding into the water and swimming out. He's caught in a rip which runs between two rows of rocks. Very rocky beach.
Yeah.
You know if you've seen it. Very dangerous. And the water's being channeled very fast. Marjorie Gillespie says it carried him out like a leaf.
Yes.
Like he went out like a leaf on the tide. Fair to suppose that he was very forcefully knocked against rocks and rendered unconscious and drowned.
Yes.
This is probably what happened.
But his body's never found.
The body was never found, although some bones were found in fishing nets near Point Cook by some scallop fishermen. A thigh bone and another leg bone, but these were never identified. I don't think DNA testing was around at that time. I thought that was more than a mere detail.
So thus comes to the end of Harold Holt's life and the story of Holt. But he was a significant figure beyond the events and circumstances of his death. And if you were to encapsulate what he should be most remembered for in one or two sentences, what do you think it is, Ross?
He was a decent man. I think he was a fine statesman. I think he had a deep love of his country and of other people. And he was a man with deep humanitarian instincts.
Well, thank you so much, Ross Walker, for this wonderful discussion on Harold Holt.
Thank you.
And your book is very much available for purchase.
Very much.
So we'll make sure we put the link in our show notes. And
Thanks
it's been
very
wonderful.
much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great to have you on Afternoon Light.
Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook.